Hello, and welcome to another hand drink solo wine info video, where today we are discussing Bodega Teodoro's Monge Ruiz, which is a wine made by a fourth generation winemaker, José Luis Ruiz, from the region of Rioja in Spain. Bodega Teodoro is laid out in the foothills of the Sierra de Cantabrias, which is a range of mountains in the sub-region of Rioja Alavesa. Vineyard plantings in Rioja Alavesa are dominated for the most part by Tempranillo, but then there's quite a lot of Garnacha or Grenache, and then splashes of Graziano and also Carignana or Carignan. But zooming back into Bodega Teodoro, although it is only about 10 hectares in size, it has an abundance of history attached to the estate. For starters, it's been in the Ruiz family since 1870. But it was only 100 years later, in 1973, when the then owner, Teodoro Ruiz, decided to create his own wine brand and name it after himself, Bodega Teodoro. And in doing so, he became the first wine farmer in Rioja to bottle his own wine under his own label, instead of doing what was traditionally done, which is to sell grapes to these larger wine houses, which were essentially wine brands, who would collect grapes from farmers all over Rioja and then create a sort of regional Riojan blend. And you'll recognize many of these brands like Faustino or Campo Viejo or Ramon Bilbao. Teodoro chose to shun the short-term financial security that came from being able to sell his grapes every year to these big producers, and chose instead quite a lot of risk, but also freedom. Freedom not only to farm the vines he wanted to, but also to make wine in the way that he wanted to. So the relevance of that decision 50 years later is that the vines on his farm are on average about 50 years old. So this makes the old vine projects in South Africa look like a veritable viticultural kindergarten. But also, the wines for Bodega Teodoro are being made by people who have tended the vines for almost their entire lives. And really, understanding your vines and your land is crucial when making high quality wines. It's very difficult to do that if the viticulturalist is completely separated from the end winemaker. Now, at present, Teodoro's son, José Luis, or Itu as he is affectionately called, is the winemaker, and he's taking over from his father. And his big mission when making wine is to express the fruit of Rioja. Now, at this point you might ask, well, when making wine, what else can you express other than the fruit? Perhaps at this point it's worth noting that historically in Rioja, the most lauded wines to come out of the region had a large component of oak to them. And not just any oak, but American oak, which is slightly more porous than French oak and has higher levels of vanillins and lactones, and so more readily contributes flavors like caramel or even coconut to a wine, which of course obscures the fruit flavors. In fact, much of what defined the style of Riojan wine was flavors derived from oak, and Itu decided early on that he does not want oak to be his legacy. So how does Itu go about showcasing the fruit of Rioja in his cellar? Well, he does a number of things. The first of which is to make it very clear to anyone who will listen that he makes all wines from the estate through the process of carbonic maceration. Now, this process does highlight a whole lot of red berry flavors and freshness in the wine, but there is also a slight alchemical irony in the process of carbonic maceration, which we'll touch on in a second. Secondly, Itu does not submit many of his wines to the long oak aging process that has previously been prescribed by traditional Rioja reserves or Grand reserves, which means that his wines are not obscured by those strong oak flavors, allowing the fruit to shine. Carbonic maceration is a process in winemaking where enzymes are able to convert malic acid into ethanol inside the grape before any yeasts have started their work. Now, obviously, to do this, you need to make sure that each little berry is still intact, because if the berry is crushed or the skin is torn, then the berry, which is technically still alive, will die, juice will run out, and traditional fermentation will kick in. But what happens in carbonic maceration is that these intact, technically still alive berries are put into a carbon dioxide rich environment, and they start to absorb that carbon dioxide, and they're starved of oxygen. What happens then inside the berry is that it flips over from aerobic cellular respiration into anaerobic cellular respiration. Now, when this happens, an enzyme called malic dehydrogenase starts to convert malic acid into ethanol and give off CO2 as a byproduct. But, and here's the trickery of it all, CO2 is not the only byproduct. There are also a whole bunch of other acids and compounds that are given off, which themselves break down and give rise to certain volatile aromas. Volatile aromas like ethyl cinnamate, which, as the name sounds, triggers aromas of cinnamon, or ethyl vanillate, which triggers aromas of vanilla. So the crazy thing about it all is that while it is true that winemakers can employ the process of carbonic maceration to create these fruit-forward fresh wines, there are processes outside of their control that create compounds that mimic the presence of oak, even if there is no oak in the maturation process. And this is why it's possible to be drinking a wine and detecting oaky notes like cinnamon or vanilla, even though the winemaker swears to you that there is no oak in the winemaking process. And when we get into the glass, well, we can see that our theory is not in vain, because there definitely are those rich fruit elements which E2 promised us. There's a nice mix of red and black. There's kind of ripe blackberries, but then also some slightly brighter red plum elements. And then there's some candy elements as well. Definitely a sense of cherry candy, which is triggered by the chemical benzaldehyde, which is also created by the carbonic maceration process. And finally, there are some slightly more serious elements of concrete dust and a little bit of fresh earth, and just a hint of that oaky spice on the finish, even though there is no oak in the maturation process. And when we take a sip, well, that Tempranillo character really comes to the fore. Those red plum elements that we smelt on the aromas carries through onto the palate with really some quite impressive concentration. But then there's also some quite lively sour red cherry elements as well. And then outside of the plum and the cherry, the tannins really are quite firm. So that combination of firm tannins but also concentrated fruit acts as a really nice little framework within which the lighter fruit elements and brighter candy notes can play quite nicely. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then consider supporting us on Patreon and subscribe to our Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we publish at least 6 videos each month talking about things like wine science, wine history, unusual cultivars, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the dynamic South African wineland.